All right, what's going on, you guys? Nick here with Nick Strength and Power. So in this video, I want to talk about the best backs in the history of bodybuilding. So typically when we think of the best backs in bodybuilding, there are two Mr. Olympia winners that come to mind, and that would be Dorian Yates and Ronnie Coleman. Now we're going to talk a little bit about Dorian and Ronnie in this video, but I also want to talk about some lesser known guys that never won the Olympia, but did in fact have some very incredible back development. So we'll talk about them in the second half of the video. The first half we'll talk about Ronnie and Dorian. So Ronnie Coleman and Dorian Yates both being in the conversation of Mr. Olympias that had the best backs of all time is really proof of one thing, and that is that high intensity, heavy training is the best way of training to build a dense, thick, grainy back. Ronnie Coleman did so with the heavy, insane deadlifts. Dorian Yates did so with that HIT style of training, those crazy Yates rows that Dorian Yates kind of popularized, which is essentially a variation of the bent over row, where you basically put some momentum into it. You use a heavier weight on the row exercise, and you use some extra momentum to get that weight for a couple extra reps. And that was the Yates row. That was one of his high intensity training to failure style of exercises. He would do heavy dumbbell rows as a very similar fashion. And that's what Dorian Yates was known for, high intensity and training to failure. And Ronnie Coleman was also known for that high-intensity style of training. And as a result, both of these men would become multiple-time Mr. Olympias. Dorian Yates, a 6-time Mr. Olympia. Ronnie Coleman, an 8-time Mr. Olympia, both of whom are considered, again, to have some of the best developed backs in the history of bodybuilding. So now I want to talk about some lesser-known bodybuilders that still had incredibly developed backs. And the first bodybuilder I want to talk about is one of the guys that's considered to have one of the best backs in the world, and that is Joel Stubbs. Now, there's a lot of photos like this circulating around the internet of Joel Stubbs' back, which of course looks absolutely insane. Now, Joel Stubbs was a relatively tall bodybuilder, competing primarily in the early 2000s, all the way up until 2009. He stood at a height of 6 foot 3 inches tall and weighed roughly 300 pounds on stage. Now, Joel Stubbs would turn pro in the year 2000, and from this point forward, I don't think he would even win a single pro show during his career. So that's probably why a lot of people haven't really heard of him, because even though he had this insane back, he was notorious for having very underdeveloped legs, and that was due to an injury he sustained to his legs very early on in his career. And those legs would drastically hold him back in placings, again, never winning a pro show to my knowledge, and his best placing at the Mr. Olympia was 16th. Now, despite some of these lackluster competitive showings, at the time, due to his height and weight, Joel Stubbs was kind of being marketed as the world's biggest bodybuilder because 6'3" is a very tall IFBB pro bodybuilder. Now, some would even go as far to say as Joel Stubbs had a better back than Dorian Yates, but again, bodybuilding being about the complete package, Dorian Yates would win 6 Olympias and Joel Stubbs would place 16th, but an argument could still be made that if you just look at the back alone, specifically the width of the lats, the development throughout the upper, mid, and lower backs, you could make an argument possibly that the back alone could be considered more impressive than Dorian Yates. But again, bodybuilding is about the complete package. Now, when talking about the best backs in the history of bodybuilding, there's another bodybuilder that comes to mind, and his name is Orville Burke. Now, when you're talking about crazy wide back and insanely wide lats, Orville Burke is a guy that comes up in conversation all the time, competing primarily in the early 2000s again, but placing significantly better than his counterpart, Joel Stubbs. Again, being a relatively tall bodybuilder at 5'10", weighing about 270 in the offseason and 250 on stage. His best placing at the Olympia would actually be 6th at the 2001 Mr. Olympia. So he actually was a top 6 Olympian. In the following year, in 2002, he would place 9th. And he would have a total of 3 Olympia appearances, including the 2000 Olympia, where he placed 10th. So all of his Olympia appearances were in the top 10. Now, he did win the Night of Champions as well. So he had won a pro show. He had placed top 6 at the Olympia. But unfortunately, he was forced to retire from bodybuilding early due to a tricep injury. Now, typically, a bodybuilder would be able to make a comeback from an injury like this after surgery, healing, then regrowing the tricep. Now, he tore his tricep. He went in for surgery. He had an allergic reaction to the drugs, and apparently had a stroke or something that caused him to go into a coma. And that was the end of his bodybuilding career. So he could have potentially gone on to do great things in bodybuilding had he been able to continue competing. But I guess we'll never know. So that's the video, guys. Those are my 2 Mr. Olympias that I believe have the best backs in the history of bodybuilding, and my 2 non-Mr. Olympias that I believe have the best backs in the history of bodybuilding. Let me know what you guys think in the comment section below, and who would you include in the list of non-Mr. Olympias that had the best backs in the history of bodybuilding. Thank you guys for watching the video, and please give it a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. Nick Strength and Power, signing out.